Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. The silence of a heavy snowfall is unlike any other sound in the world. A thick and suffocating blanket that seems to swallow the very soul of the neighborhood, leaving me feeling like the last person left on a dead planet. I remember standing by the frosted glass of my second-story bedroom window, holding a lukewarm mug of cocoa that had long since lost its steam, just watching the rhythmic descent of white flakes under the amber glow of the streetlights. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the world was supposed to be filled with the warmth of family and the soft hum of holiday music. But my house was deathly quiet because a massive blizzard had cut the power to my entire block 3 hours ago. I was enjoying the peace at first, convinced that the world could wait for a few hours while I bathed in the silver moonlight reflecting off the pristine, untouched snow covering my front yard. But then, my heart skipped a beat and a cold needle of ice seemed to slide down my spine when I looked down at the porch directly below me. There, cutting through the perfect, velvety white powder like a scar, was a single set of heavy footprints leading from the sidewalk straight to my front door. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, my breath fogging the pain as I searched the yard for the corresponding trail that should have led back out to the street. But there was nothing. The footprints ended abruptly at my doorstep, and there was no exit trail, no sign of anyone leaving, and the snow around the rest of the yard remained as smooth and undisturbed as a fresh sheet of paper. Someone had walked up to my house, but they had never walked away, and the terrifying realization began to settle in that they were likely still standing right beneath me on the porch where I couldn't see them. I pulled back from the window, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I found myself holding my breath as if the mere sound of my lungs working would alert the shadow outside to my exact location. Why hadn't they knocked? And why were they standing there in the freezing darkness instead of seeking help or walking back to their own home? I set the mug down on the nightstand with agonizing slowness, making sure the ceramic didn't click against the wood, and I began to tiptoe toward the top of the stairs where the darkness of the lower floor looked like a yawning black mouth waiting to swallow me whole. Every floorboard in this old Victorian house felt like a landmine, and I moved with the precision of a ghost, my eyes straining to catch any flicker of movement through the banisters. As I reached the landing, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound began to vibrate through the floorboards, coming from the direction of the front door. It wasn't a loud, aggressive pounding, but rather a methodical, patient scraping, like a metal tool being dragged slowly across the wood or a fingernail searching for a gap in the weather stripping. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the intruder wasn't just waiting. They were testing the integrity of the lock, feeling for the weak points that the cold weather might have expanded. I needed to find a weapon, but my kitchen was at the back of the house, and to get there, I would have to pass the front hallway where only a thin sheet of oak separated me from whatever was lurking in the storm. I gripped the banister so hard my knuckles turned white, and I began to descend the stairs one agonizing inch at a time, while my mind raced through every possible scenario of who could be out there. Was it a stranded motorist looking for a phone? Or was it someone who had been watching me turn off my lights and wait for the cover of the blizzard to move in? The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. A heavy pressure that seemed to make my ears ring in the void of the dark hallway. I reached the bottom step and pressed my back against the wall, sliding toward the kitchen while keeping my eyes glued to the silhouette of the front door. Just as I reached the archway of the kitchen, the floorboards in the mudroom at the very back of the house let out a sharp, agonizing groan. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen in my veins because the mudroom was on the opposite side of the house from the front door, meaning there wasn't just one person, or the person had found a way to move around the exterior of the house without leaving a single footprint in the snow. But that was impossible unless they had been hiding under the crawl space of the wraparound porch the entire time, waiting for the exact moment I moved away from the window. I reached into the knife block and pulled out the heaviest blade I could find, the cold steel feeling strangely heavy and foreign in my shaking hand. "Who's there?" I tried to scream, but my voice came out as a pathetic, dry rasp that barely carried past my own lips. I cleared my throat and tried again, projecting my voice with a false bravado that I didn't feel, demanding to know what they wanted and telling them that I had already called the police. It was a lie, of course, because the cell towers were down from the storm and my landline had gone dead the moment the power cut, leaving me completely isolated in a frozen wasteland. There was no response from the mudroom, only the sound of the wind howling through the eaves and the distant crack of a tree limb breaking under the weight of the ice. I moved toward the mudroom door, my heart tripping over itself, and I realized the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of the freezing night air cutting through the warmth of the kitchen. I hadn't left that door open, and I knew for a fact I had locked it before the sun went down. As I reached out to slam it shut, a hand, pale and blue-tinted from the cold, reached through the gap and gripped the edge of the frame. It wasn't the hand of a monster, but the hand of a man, his fingernails ragged and his skin covered in a fine layer of frost. I didn't think. I simply threw my entire weight against the door, feeling the satisfying thud of the wood hitting something solid and the muffled cry of pain from the other side. I shoved the heavy kitchen table in front of the door, my muscles screaming with the effort, and I backed away as the person on the other side began to kick the door with a desperate, rhythmic violence. "Let me in," a voice hissed, not with the tone of someone seeking help, but with a terrifying, predatory calm that made my skin crawl. "It's so cold out here, and I know you're alone. I saw you at the window. I've been watching you since the first flake fell." The kicking stopped, and I heard the sound of glass shattering in the living room. He had given up on the door and simply broken a window, and I knew I had seconds before he was inside the house with me. I ran for the basement door, sliding inside and locking it just as I heard the heavy boots hit the hardwood floor of the kitchen. I descended into the darkness of the cellar, hiding behind the furnace and clutching the knife to my chest, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps pacing directly above my head. He was mocking me, walking slowly so I could hear exactly where he was, his boots creaking on the floorboards as he moved from the kitchen to the hallway, searching for the door I had disappeared behind. He reached the basement door and turned the handle, the lock holding firm for now, but then I heard the sound of a heavy object being dragged across the floor. He was blocking the door from the outside, trapping me in the cellar so I couldn't escape while he took his time figuring out how to get to me. I looked around the dark basement, my eyes adjusting to the gloom, and I saw the small coal chute at the back of the foundation, a tiny opening that led out to the side yard. It was a tight fit, and it would be a struggle, but it was my only chance. I scrambled toward the chute, pushing the heavy iron cover aside and pulling myself up into the narrow stone tunnel. The cold air hit my face like a physical blow, and I crawled through the snow and ice, my fingers numbing instantly as I clawed my way toward the surface. I burst out into the night, tumbling into a deep drift, and I didn't stop to look back. I ran toward the lights of the main road, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I saw the flashing blue and red lights of a utility truck working on a downed power line. The workmen saw me, a shivering, terrified figure emerging from the woods, and they took me into their cab and called for the authorities over their radio. When the police finally arrived at my house an hour later, the intruder was gone. I moved out the following week, and I never go back to that town during the winter. Whenever it starts to snow, I don't look out the window anymore, because I'm always afraid I'll see a single set of tracks leading toward my door, and no tracks leading away. The hum of the refrigerator was the only thing keeping me company in the sweltering heat of my apartment, which felt strangely claustrophobic despite the festive decorations I had spent all morning hanging up. I had been waiting for my grocery delivery for over 3 hours, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the world outside my window a messy blur of blue shadows and swirling flurries. I remember checking the app on my phone for the 10th time, seeing the little icon of the delivery driver named Marcus sitting stationary at a red light 3 miles away, but something felt off about the way the GPS seemed to flicker and jump across the map. When the buzzing of the intercom finally jolted me out of my chair, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, thinking I could finally finish my meal prep and settle in for a quiet Christmas Eve alone. I pressed the button to release the main lobby door and stood by my apartment entrance, listening to the heavy, uneven thud of footsteps echoing up the concrete stairwell of my building. As the footsteps grew louder and closer, I realized they didn't have the hurried, light rhythm of a delivery person trying to make their quota, but were instead slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone carrying a weight they weren't used to. When the figure finally rounded the corner of the hallway, my heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest because the man standing there was not the smiling, college-aged Marcus from the app's profile picture. This man was much older, wearing a tattered, stained high-visibility vest that looked like it had been pulled out of a dumpster, and his eyes were hidden behind the reflective glare of thick, salt-crusted glasses. "Delivery for 4B, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the narrow hallway, and he didn't wait for me to invite him closer before he dropped 2 heavy paper bags right at my feet. I reached for my wallet to give him a small tip, wanting the interaction to end as quickly as possible, but as I looked down, I noticed he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, his gaze fixed on the small wooden bowl on my entryway table. "You still keep your spare key in that blue ceramic dish by the mirror, don't you, Sarah?" he whispered, and the sound of my own name coming from the stranger's mouth felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I froze, my fingers fumbling with the zipper of my purse, as a cold realization began to dawn on me that I had never told this man my name, and I certainly hadn't told him where I kept my spare key. My mind raced back through the last year, trying to place his face, and then it hit me like a splash of freezing water. He had been a temporary maintenance worker for the building during the previous winter, someone I had complained about to the management because he had spent too much time lingering in my doorway during a radiator repair. He had been fired shortly after, and yet here he was, standing in my hallway under the guise of a holiday delivery service, knowing exactly how my home was laid out. The app said Marcus was delivering, I managed to say, my voice trembling as I tried to step back and pull the door shut, but he had already moved his heavy, work-booted foot into the gap of the doorframe. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, a crooked, yellowed smile spreading across his face as he leaned his weight against the wood, preventing me from locking him out. Marcus had an accident in the parking lot. I told him I'd finish his route for him. It's the season of giving, isn't it? And I remember you being so very particular about your things. The tension in the hallway became a living thing, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe as I realized that the accident he mentioned was likely the reason he was wearing a vest that didn't fit and holding a phone that wasn't his. I gripped the edge of the door, my knuckles white, and I knew that if I let him push his way in, I wouldn't be able to get him out again without a fight I wasn't prepared for. "I'm calling the police right now," I lied, reaching for my phone in my pocket, but he just chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "With the storm out there, the response time is over 40 minutes. I've been watching the scanners. They're all busy with the pileup on the interstate." He began to push harder, the door groaning against the hinges, and I realized I couldn't hold him back for much longer with my strength alone. I looked down at the grocery bags he had dropped and noticed the neck of a heavy glass sparkling cider bottle peeking out from the top of the paper. In one fluid motion, I reached down, grabbed the cold glass neck, and swung it with everything I had against the side of the doorframe, shattering the bottom of the bottle into a jagged, lethal edge. The sound of the glass breaking was like a gunshot in the quiet hallway, and the man recoiled, pulling his foot back just enough for me to slam the door and throw the deadbolt. I didn't stop there. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed my heavy cast iron skillet, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts as I heard him pounding on the wood from the other side. "You always were ungrateful, Sarah?" he screamed, his voice no longer a rasp but a jagged, hateful roar that echoed through the thin walls of the apartment. I heard him throw his shoulder against the door once, twice, and the wood began to splinter around the lock, making me realize that the old Victorian door wouldn't hold against a grown man's desperation for long. I scrambled into my bathroom, locking the second door behind me and climbing into the bathtub, clutching my phone and dialing the emergency number over and over, praying for a signal to break through the interference of the storm. I heard the front door finally give way with a sickening crack, followed by the slow, rhythmic sound of him walking through my living room, humming a distorted, minor key version of a Christmas carol. He was taking his time, knocking over my decorations, the sound of breaking ornaments crunching under his boots like frozen bone. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice sounding uncomfortably close, right outside the bathroom door. "I saw the light under the crack. You can't hide in a room with no windows, Sarah. That was your first mistake." I sat in the dark, my heart beating so loud I was sure he could hear it through the drywall, and I waited for the handle to turn. But instead of a forced entry, I heard the sound of the front door to my apartment opening again, followed by the heavy, authoritative voices of two men shouting for everyone to get on the ground. It turns out that the real delivery driver, Marcus, hadn't been in an accident. He had seen the man following him and had called his supervisor, who had alerted the local patrol that was already in the building checking on a different noise complaint. The holiday temp was tackled just inches from the bathroom door, and as the police led him away in handcuffs, he never stopped staring at me through the open doorway, that same crooked smile frozen on his face. I spent the rest of my Christmas Eve at the police station, and when I finally returned home, the first thing I did was throw away that blue ceramic dish and every spare key I owned. I don't order things delivered to my door anymore, and I never trust a face that isn't the one I'm expecting, because the holidays have a way of bringing out the people who have been waiting all year for a reason to step inside. The neighborhood of Willow Creek was always famous for its competitive Christmas spirit, a place where every house was draped in thousands of shimmering LEDs and inflatable displays that turned the suburban street into a neon wonderland of red, green, and gold. I usually loved the glow, finding comfort in the way the lights chased away the oppressive shadows of the winter solstice. But this year, the brightness felt like a spotlight that I couldn't escape. It started on the 21st of December, a night so cold that the air seemed to crackle with frost, when I went to my front window to admire the snowfall and noticed something moving on the roof of the house directly across the street. My neighbor, Mr. Silas Vane, was a quiet man who lived alone, and at first, I thought he was just adjusting his plastic reindeer or fixing a loose strand of lights that had been flickering in the wind. But as I stood there in the dark of my living room, I realized with a sudden, jarring jolt of fear that he wasn't moving at all. He was standing perfectly still on the peak of his roof, dressed in a heavy dark parka, staring directly into my second-story bedroom window. I pulled the curtain shut, my heart racing with an irrational sense of violation, telling myself that he was probably just looking at the horizon or checking his own shingles for ice damage. But when I ventured a peek 10 minutes later, he was still there, a black silhouette against the glowing stars, his body angled toward me with a terrifying, unwavering focus. I didn't sleep that night, convinced that if I closed my eyes, those distant, unblinking eyes would somehow find a way into my dreams. By the second night, the situation had shifted from strange to deeply disturbing because as soon as the sun dipped below the trees, Mr. Silas Vane was back on his roof, standing in the exact same spot like a gargoyle carved from ice. I tried to go about my evening, making dinner and watching television, but I could feel the weight of his gaze through the walls, a physical pressure that made the back of my neck itch with a primal warning. Why wasn't anyone else noticing him? Why weren't the other neighbors calling out to ask what he was doing on his roof in the middle of a sub-zero night? I realized then that the blinding brightness of the holiday displays worked in his favor, as the glare of the flashing lights made it almost impossible for anyone on the street level to see what was happening on the dark, shingled rooftops above. I decided to call him, hoping that a simple conversation would break the spell and reveal a harmless explanation for his behavior. I found his number in the neighborhood directory and listened to the rhythmic ringing, my eyes fixed on his dark form across the street as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a glowing device. He didn't answer, but I saw the light of his phone screen illuminate his face for a split second, and the expression I saw wasn't one of confusion or neighborly greeting, but a wide, toothy grin that looked completely devoid of sanity. He stared directly at my window as the call went to voicemail, and I watched as he slowly raised his hand and waved, a tiny mechanical motion that sent a wave of cold dread through my entire body. The third night was when the game changed, because when I looked out the window, the roof was empty, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a sense of immense relief wash over me. But as I walked into my kitchen to get a glass of water, I noticed that the motion-activated floodlights in my own backyard were triggered, bathing the snow in a harsh white glare. I peered through the glass of the back door, and my breath hitched in my throat when I saw a trail of footprints leading from the fence straight to the side of my house, where my heavy-duty extension ladder was stored. I heard a dull thud against the siding, a vibration that traveled through the frame of the house, and I realized with a sickening horror that he wasn't watching from across the street anymore. He was climbing onto my roof. I ran to the front door and fumbled with the locks, my hands shaking so violently that I dropped my keys twice, the metal clanging against the hardwood like a death knell. I managed to get the door open and sprinted out onto the sidewalk, looking up at my own roofline just in time to see his boots disappearing over the gutter. I stood in the middle of the street, screaming for help, my voice lost in the festive music blaring from a neighbor's outdoor speakers 3 houses down. No one came to their windows and no one opened their doors because the world was too busy celebrating to notice a woman standing in her pajamas in the snow, pointing at a phantom on her roof. I realized then that I couldn't stay outside in the cold forever, and the thought of him being up there, looking for a way in through the attic vents or the skylight, made me feel like a trapped animal. I took my phone out and dialed the police, my voice cracking as I explained the situation to the operator, who sounded skeptical but promised to send a patrol car when one became available. I didn't wait for them. I ran to my car, which was parked in the driveway, and locked myself inside, keeping the engine running and the headlights pointed at my front door. As I sat there, the heater blowing hot air into my face, I saw him again. He leaned over the edge of my roof, his face upside down as he peered into the car window from 20 feet above, and he began to drop something. Small, colorful objects fell through the air, landing on my windshield with soft, muffled thuds. They were my own Christmas lights. He had spent the last hour silently cutting the strands from my house, systematically stripping away the glow until my home was the only dark spot on the entire street. He slid down the pillars of the porch with the agility of a predator and landed in the snow with a soft puff of white powder, standing just 5 feet away from my car door. He didn't try to break the glass. He just stood there, holding a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, and began to snip the air in a slow, rhythmic motion. "You look better in the dark," he mouthed through the window, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting the multicolored lights from the neighboring houses. The arrival of the police car, its sirens silent but its blue and red lights flashing, was the only thing that broke his trance. He didn't run. He simply dropped the cutters and put his hands behind his head, laughing as the officers tackled him into the snowbank. When they searched his house later that night, they found a room filled with high-powered telescopes pointed at every single window on our block, along with hundreds of photographs of the neighbors taken from the rooftops. Mr. Silas Vane wasn't just watching me. He had been mapping the entire neighborhood's movements for years, using the holiday lights as a way to hide his presence in the shadows. I spent that Christmas in a hotel 3 towns away, and I haven't put up a single light since that night. Now, when I walk through my neighborhood in December, I don't look at the beautiful displays or the twinkling stars. I only look up at the dark, silent ridges of the roofs.